Hey everybody from Anth278, welcome. My name is Corey Markus, and I researched Josef Mengele for my project. I'm going to be talking to you all about his background, the experiments he conducted, and how all of this relates to scientific racism along the way. I have his nickname written here, the Angel of Death, and we're going to pretty quickly find out how and why he earned this name. So who was he? Well, Josef Mengele was a high-ranking German officer and physician. Upon going to university, he became fascinated with eugenics and selective breeding. As we learned earlier in the course, selective breeding was a term coined by Francis Galton, and the idea of this was to increase the birth and marriage of those from superior races, in theory to pass on the best desirable traits. He became a head doctor at various concentration camps, the biggest of which was at Auschwitz in southern Poland. He was initially here to conduct genetic research, but as you can probably imagine, it just took off from here. He oversaw the experiments on Jewish prisoners, so he was responsible for selecting those test subjects and subsequently carrying out those experiments. His most famous experiments were the twin experiments. We're going to touch on those later. So just briefly touching on his early life. Mengele was born March 1911 in Günzburg, Bavaria, to a family of farm machine manufacturers. However, when World War I started, they actually transitioned into ammunition manufacturing. So it becomes obvious that from an early age, Mengele was exposed to war and all that goes along with war. He struggled in elementary school, but by the end he ended up turning himself around. He finished at the top of his class and went on to Munich University. So as I just mentioned, Mengele got started at Munich University at the age of 19. Now this was the same university attended by Louis Agassiz, who we learned about earlier in the term. Just as a little refresher, Agassiz was a polygenist who discredited Darwinian evolution. This meant that he believed superior races like himself came from one creation event, while other inferior races were from an unrelated event with a separate set of parents. To them, this fully explained why some races were better and superior to others. Race mixing would simply result in an ill-adapted hybrid. So it becomes clear that there were some ties of using science to justify racism present at Munich University, and this is reflective in Mengele. He studied anthropology as a result of his fascination with eugenics and its effects. Mengele later went on to join the Steel Helmets in 1931. This was a political activist group in Germany that advocated for its return to the pre-war monarchy. This was the first step in getting into German politics, and ultimately this was the way that people got into the National Socialist Party, also known as the Nazis. He pushed for a return of Germany to pride and purity. He connected his social Darwinism that he learned in the classroom to this political movement being expressed through the Socialist Party. So now that we've seen his history, we really can start to get a sense of his racial biases and where they came from. In 1935, Mengele earned his PhD in anthropology. His dissertation was entitled Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Draw Section for Racial Groups. This was his attempt to prove German superiority through science, bias-free. However, if there's anything we've learned, it's that all of these anthropologists, scientists, and physicians claim to be conducting purely scientific research. However, it wouldn't have been possible for them to prove their superiority without these because they simply don't exist. He later began working for the Institute of Heredity, Biology, and Racial Purity at the University of Frankfurt. While here, he was responsible for examining those accused of breaking the Nuremberg laws. These were anti-Semitic laws passed in Nazi Germany that were for the protection of German blood and German honor. This forbade the marriage and sex of Jewish women under 45 to German men. This was essentially the first form of sterilization. This would ensure that no offspring would be the result of miscegenation, which, as we know, is a mixing of races. To maintain that pure German lineage, they thought there could be no mixing of Germans with the inferior race because it would result in their genetic decline. In May of 1937, he joined the Schutzstaffel, which was created as a group to protect Hitler, but that role was later expanded to running concentration camps. In 1943, after having fought in World War II, he was promoted to captain and transferred to Auschwitz. Before going into the specifics of his experiments at Auschwitz, I just want to talk about a brief overview of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a mass genocide of Jewish and other populations that Adolf Hitler and his regime deemed impure. Their solution to this, which they called the final solution, was mass killings and sterilization. This was based on eugenics. They didn't want their inferior races to be breeding with the superior races and passing those genetics on. They wanted to maintain it as pure as they could. The idea of it was to return Germany to a place of racial purity and greatness. And obviously, to do that, it would require removing the people who weren't German. This all stemmed from the notion that the Jews were a different inferior race, and that mixing them would result in degeneration, lessened intelligence, and a weaker race overall. The consequences of the Holocaust cannot be overstated. About 17 million people in total were murdered. 6 million of those were Jews. 2/3 of the Jewish population overall were dead. I just want to leave this with you for a few seconds. Let the thoughts of the angel of death soak in. Mengele's experiments were nothing short of horrifying. Upon arriving to Auschwitz, he wasted no time. On his first day there, he sought out prisoners as his tough subjects who were extremely tall, midgets, had deformities, and had mental illnesses. Twin children were especially interesting to him, and this is to be discussed next. He, of course, justified all of this through the fact that they were a different race than the Germans and therefore were inferior. One of the tests he conducted on them were the voltage endurance tests. In these tests, the patient was given a shock of electricity, and if they could withstand that electricity shock was upped more and more until they could no longer withstand it. This left people unconscious, put them into coma, and even killed some of them. Surgeries were also conducted without anesthesia. He performed castrations on little boys with the goal of sterilizing them so they could no longer pass on the traits that the Germans had deemed undesirable. He also removed organs, again, without anesthesia. Mengele conducted the most extensive research experiments on the twins. Why was this? Well, they had the weird belief that because they were twins, they had some key to hereditary supremacy. They believed that if a mother was able to produce 2 offspring of the superior race that were above other races, then this meant that they had extra potential to pass on those traits. So again, he tested on these twins without anesthesia. He would amputate the limbs of them and inject gangrene into the wounds to study the infection. He injected chemical dyes into their eyes to attempt to change their eye color. He even intentionally injected diseases such as tuberculosis and typhus to compare the reactions in that twin to the other twin. On top of that, he conducted blood transfusions between twins. In these transfusions, he would transfer almost all of the blood from one twin to the other, just to see what would happen, and to test the robustness of their genes. Anytime one of the twins died, like from a disease or any other reason, they would kill the other twin for a post-mortem. They'd then compare the differences between these to see if they handled death the same way. An assistant doctor later confirmed the idea that there was actually no scientific legitimacy behind the experiments, and that they were all instead fueled purely by hatred. Another doctor recalled one occasion in which Mengele personally killed 14 twins in one night by injecting their hearts with chloroform. He used all of these people as guinea pigs with no remorse or empathy whatsoever. It's really hard to say much more about a man who can live his life with no remorse or feelings of regret for the things that he's done like this. Now let's just talk a little bit about why it all matters. This really shows what can happen when an ill-fated science and prejudice are legitimized and used by a person in power. One person with enough power and a horrible, unspeakable agenda can have unfathomable repercussions. What this really boils down to is the importance of education on the history of racism and where all of our misconceptions come from, and more importantly, how we can change that looking into the future. We all have to learn from the past, and from learning the past, we can react differently in the future, knowing what can happen when something like this goes out of control. We have to change the way we see each other, because after all, there is only one race.